Welcome to ActualizeMen. Carl here. And a question for you: should I circumcise my infant son? I'm going to give you my opinion and some food for thought. You make up your own mind. I'm not here to preach to you, but my view is I believe this practice is terribly harming men, and for a number of reasons. First and foremost, let's talk about the data. Okay. Religious practice around circumcision was typically done as a coming-of-age ritual, which means that the boy was around age 12, age 13, age 14. Okay? He could give consent. Okay? It was never done on infants. And I think that there were a lot of reasons why. First and foremost, I think this practice profoundly damages the mother-son relationship. There are three big messages that I think are communicated to a boy if he's circumcised in infancy. Number one, you're not safe with your mother. Number two, your body is not your own. And number three, there's something wrong with you, something unclean, something just not right about you. God screwed up, and your mother agrees, and she allows it to happen. I think these messages are incredibly damaging to men. Some time ago, I read the work of Wilhelm Reich. There's quite a few books. I didn't read all of them, but he found that the pleasure circuitry in the brain, not only just our nerves, but also in the brain, takes about 10 to 15 years to fully develop. Okay? And the experience of pleasure, what Reich called orgastic gratification, is how human beings discharge feelings of anxiety. It's how we self-regulate. Okay? And for men, about 50% of the nerves of the pleasure circuitry are found within the foreskin. So when we remove the foreskin, what we are doing is we are reducing the man's ability to experience pleasure by 50% or more. So the implication of that, to my mind, what I know about the body, is that this man will become more likely to seek external ways of soothing himself, of regulating himself, of discharging that energy. He'll start looking outside of himself. Okay? He won't be regulating from within. Not to mention the fact that surgery itself can be quite a traumatic experience, and there may be some dissociation that takes place, which may be lasting. So, some men I've talked to have reported that there's just no issue whatsoever, but I've also asked them, well, how would you know what you've lost if you never knew what you had in the first place? And I just get a blank look. Some men are horrifically traumatized by this practice. They have a lot of pain, a lot of scar tissue. They lack sensation. Sex is not pleasurable. But nobody is talking about this. Nobody wants to really discuss this. And I've also spoken with some mothers about this, and I've listened to their concerns. Like, for example, some mothers have said to me, well, I've heard it's a hygiene thing and that it's better to have my son circumcised so there's no danger of any infection or anything like that. I've heard others say that, well, I want him to look the same as all the other boys in the changing room. And then there are sometimes the fathers weighing in as like, I want him to look just the way that I look. Now, each one of these I have an issue with. Okay, let's take the last one where the father's like, I want him to look just the way I look. And I'm like, well, if he's your son, he probably already looks a lot like you. You really have to go do surgery on his penis to go that extra mile? Really? And as far as the first two, those are really female values, right? What's the herd think? What are the herd fitting in with the crowd? And not so much with hygiene, but it's the hygiene thing is an old wives' tale. There's no problem with hygiene whatsoever. The overriding message that is being communicated here is that there's something inherently wrong with you. There's something wrong with nature's design. This is a terrible message to give a child the moment he's born. You know what I mean? I just think it really, people lack thought around this. But perhaps one of the overarching things for me that is problematic with this is that we've talked about the pleasure circuitry, but the whole sexual pleasure circuitry, instead of being associated just with pleasure, becomes associated with violation, with mutilation, and with pain. Now, how do you think that's going to show up later in life? How do you think the effect of what's happened to the mother-son relationship, the trust that has been broken, betrayed even, some might say, how do you think that's going to show up in that man's relationship with other women, with life in general? You know, when I talk about how men seek external means of self-regulating, what that might look like is they may look to drugs, they may look to working too hard, right? Becoming workaholics. They may look to becoming sex addicts because they're looking for some means of soothing what's going on inside by what is being done to them. Society is just doing this like a machine to these boys. And then somewhere along the line, I'm hearing that society wants to lecture boys about rape culture. The hypocrisy in this entire situation just boggles my mind. And yet nobody seems to be discussing the implications of what is being done. Perhaps it would be instructive to also ask doctors how much they're being compensated for conducting infant circumcision. Maybe it would be good to know the price tag associated with the procedure. I've even heard stories of mothers giving birth, their infant son being taken into another room, circumcised and brought back, without even the mother's consent. Guys, I think this is a real problem. I think we need to wake up to what attitudes we deeply hold towards the body. If we are, as a society, violating boys' bodies, but then we're shaming men and chastising men for supposedly not respecting women's bodies, there's a hypocrisy in our position. As I said, personally, I think that this practice is causing a lot of damage. It's causing a tremendous amount of damage to men. And men who have been circumcised don't really know what they've lost. They may not even know what they're feeling or why they feel what they feel. But there's a great deal of unconsciousness around this. You know, when we experience trauma, when we human beings experience trauma, oftentimes what happens is dissociation. And dissociation is like our consciousness leaving the body. There's so much unconsciousness around this practice. Are we kicking the can down the road and making the next generation more unconscious by inflicting this on the next generation of men? That was my reason for making this video. I want to bring more consciousness to the conversation. I mean, if after what I've shared with you, you're like, well, Carl, it's tradition. I'm not strong enough to turn away from the herd and do what I feel is right. And yes, I've deliberately phrased it that way. Then that's up to you. But consciousness requires you to take responsibility for what you believe and what you feel in the face of really looking at what is the truth of what I'm doing. I think how men feel about themselves is really important. If we're going to shift the culture in a more healthy direction, it's important that men learn to love themselves. It's important that men are given constructive, positive messaging. Okay? Men can't go on to love women and children and build families and what have you if they don't love themselves. And it's really hard to love and accept yourself when society at every turn is giving you all this messaging that there's something wrong with you, something needs to be changed, God screwed up, there's something wrong with your sexuality. Sometimes the thought has occurred to me that this routine practice of circumcision has got nothing to do with benefiting men, that it's actually some kind of pagan blood sacrifice. I know that sounds weird, but think about it. Why are we doing this? In modern day, why? What are we doing this? Because if we're conducting a blood sacrifice, what we're actually doing is we're denying Christianity. We're denying the sacrifice of Jesus, and we're saying a blood sacrifice has to be paid. Hey, I'm just the messenger. I think that this issue also shows up in the sex act itself. For men who have a lot of scar tissue where they can't feel much, there's not much in the way of sensation because of the damage to the nerve endings. And so there's an awful lot of friction. There's the proverbial jackhammer, which, people talk about, just jackhammering to just try and get to this place, versus the pelvis that can move and articulate more freely. Well, again, Wilhelm Reich identified that stiff, frozen pelvis as one of the biggest problems of the modern age, that people's pelvises are locked up, and in so being, their creativity, their sex energy, their life energy is locked up in their pelvis. There's so much tension in the pelvis that even sex itself is no longer really that pleasurable. It's more mechanical. So there's this frantic activity to compensate for this inability to feel. And I think that's a deep metaphor for men, not only in the sex act, but how they do life, how they do work. They have to work even harder, right, to try and get some gratification. Think of the messaging. Think of what's being set up here. Work hard, work hard, work hard. This is the slave program, right? It starts with the sexuality. This is what I'm talking about. Really get into what this means, is that you can feel so little, you're trying to compensate. So work harder, work harder, work harder. Jackhammer, go, go, go. This is America, guys. You know what I'm talking about. I mean, if society is giving the message to men that your body is not good enough, you're not good enough the way you are, there's something wrong with you, then automatically, unconsciously, it's setting men up to start working harder to compensate for that. And I've asked this question of women, how would you feel if your body was violated? How would you feel if the issue of consent was completely sidestepped and that you were put under the knife and your body was mutilated? But not only that, but your ability to experience pleasure was reduced by over 50%. How would that sit with you? And in every single case, the penny drops and they're like, oh, yeah, well, what we're doing here with infant boys is routine. Very few people that I've talked to seem to have given it this level of thought. And, I started with the question, what are we doing and why? And no one really has done a longitudinal study on how these men who have been circumcised fare in life with their relationships with life and work and themselves and women and whatnot. And I think it would behoove us as a society to really examine what we are doing to bring more consciousness to the conversation, okay? And not let our emotions get all, not let our emotions cloud the issue. Let's talk about the implications of what we're doing. Let's make an informed decision. And let's be mindful of what we're putting out there and what can come back to us. I think that the societal messaging in the West is giving men the message that you're not good enough. Your body's not your own. Even your mother believes you're not good enough. And you now have to work hard to overcome this judgment on you. That's a pagan point of view. That's a pre-Jesus Christ point of view. I think it's very destructive. I think it sets men up to not only show up in their life, but in their relationships. They're coming from a deficit. You're already behind, so come on, jump. Let's see you work for it. That's pre-Jesus. That's pre-Christianity. I think it's a lot easier to have men respect women's bodies and respect consent because they themselves have been respected. And their bodies have been respected, their consent has been respected, their sexuality has been respected. It's a lot easier to say to boys, hey, respecting women's bodies because it's important. They've actually felt the respect. They've actually received that respect. And I think that that will make a ripple effect through culture in a positive direction, which is so very needed. Okay? The adults are the ones who are allowing this to happen, and they can choose it. So thank you all for thank you all for listening. Give me a comment, let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you on the next video.